All right. Good afternoon, and thank you, Tom, for being with us here in our Business of Journalism class.
Pleasure.
I'm sure other students will be joining us, and like I've said, they'll all be required. If they're not here, they're going to be required to watch the video later. So thank you. Um, we will keep this to absolutely no more than an hour. I'm not going to do any introductions on the video here because all the students have access to your bio in the Blackboard classroom. As I've said, we're recording this, so we'll go ahead and dive in. We were just talking before we started about your new job. What is a senior director for content, and what will you be doing, and why?
Great question. And it's one of those convoluted titles that only the marriage of a university and a state agency could come up with. There are similar jobs at other PBS stations that carry titles like Chief Content Officer. But in essence, I'm responsible for all content production and local production for the statewide network serving North Carolina. And when I say all, that means both traditional broadcast television as well as our growing range of digital elements. A lot of my time, even just today, has been focused on how do we take a existing 5-night-a-week news show and turn it into a weekly news magazine that stretches more beyond just the confines of happened yesterday. How do we take our digital multicast channels, Channel 4.2, available only on your digital HDTV or on Time Warner Cable. How do we program some of those almost as niche networks appealing to substantially smaller audiences in much the same way that Discovery is Discovery, but they also own the Science Channel that gets much narrower and really seeks to super serve an audience. So, at one level, it's all just storytelling, right? How do we tell stories about North Carolina? But given my unique ability to not really hold any job or even my own attention for terribly long, how do I take this background of print and digital and some television network experience and use that to expand the range of storytelling we're able to do here at UNCTV?
Now, tell us a little bit about what the nature of your previous job is. So you just changed jobs 6 days ago. What was that job, and how do you feel like this is an evolution in your career?
Great question. So my previous title was Senior Director of Station Outreach at PBS Digital. A more down-to-earth way of putting it was I was a corporate weenie. I was on the corporate staff of PBS Digital, really serving as the liaison between what we were doing there to build products, services, a video player and video management system, a easy-to-use web content management system for stations that didn't want to spool up their own. How do we get that information out to stations? How do we help stations decide how to use those tools to achieve their business goals? Part of the biggest part of that role really was figuring out how we can take a lot of those tools that we already had in place and then use them to build members-only benefits for stations. Instead of just flogging, this Susie Orman DVD in exchange for your generous contribution, how could we create an Amazon Prime-like service that would allow donors of a station to get access to back archives of video that are no longer available for free? That was really the last 2 years of head-down work at PBS. The evolution, I would say, there is, I came into PBS 5 years ago, the world of public media 5 years ago, after 22 years at Tribune Company. Kurt and I worked together at Sun Sentinel in the newsroom. I had roles beyond the newsroom there and business leadership of digital operations at a couple of their newspapers. And then working on the corporate staff at Tribune Interactive. I came into PBS after Tribune essentially cratered and needed time to really figure out what's the difference between working for a for-profit company and a decidedly non-profit organization. What's the difference working for a company that was focused on local media business units, and one that is sort of a combination of a classic television network and a member association, because all of our stations are independently owned and operated. After 5 years of doing that, I learned an enormous amount about running nonprofits. I learned an enormous amount about the rewarding and very weird world of public media. And I also figured out that most of the impact, most of the ability to affect change in public media is out at the stations. It's not at PBS or necessarily at NPR. Combine that with the fact that between my time at Tribune Interactive on corporate and my time at PBS, I had spent almost 10 years in a corporate staff role. And I really wanted to get back into a role where it was less about cajoling and offering advice and putting together plans that somebody may or may not actually implement, and instead be in a role where, no, I control my own fate and destiny, and if the project fails, it's on me.
I wonder if I can give you an example, and if you can tell me if this is the sort of thing that might fall into your bailiwick in another context.
Mm-hmm.
This is radio, not television, but here in St. Louis, the local public radio station about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, merged with a nonprofit. You're already familiar with this.
Oh, the Beacon, which was housed in the public television station next door to the radio station. Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah, yeah. And is this the sort of thing that perhaps somebody in your position could dream up in their market?
Absolutely. So an example here at UNC, underway long before I got here. We're creating a job that we'll be filling in the next couple of weeks here of somebody who can just beat the bushes and identify all the independent media makers out there. A lot of them have business cards already that say documentary filmmaker or independent television producer. But we know there's a world beyond that. There are people out there who are capable of doing data viz on demand, or people who are out there creating YouTube series or other digital-first video efforts. And we want to know about those projects, knowing that some of them can find a place on our air, many others of which can find a place on our website and our streaming devices and apps. We can serve the role public media has always played, which is serving as a distribution platform for a lot of these independent productions. I would say that's very analogous in its own way to what happened with St. Louis Public Radio and with the Beacon, in the sense that in today's media age, it's often a matter not of what you do yourself, but who out there is doing something that fits your ethos and makes a good collaboration partner.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I should summarize a little bit more thoroughly for the benefit of anybody who watches this later, this idea that the St. Louis Beacon, established by refugees from the Post-Dispatch, a nonprofit news organization exclusively online, then ends up merging with St. Louis Public Radio in a couple of steps it actually took.
Yep.
And now they are exclusively identified as St. Louis Public Radio, and it's essentially the second largest news operation in the St. Louis market right now.
And it's a fine example of overlapping interests. You know, what Margie Freivogel did with the Beacon was fabulous, but once some of their initial grant funding began to run out, they were really faced with the challenge of how do we support this multi-million-dollar-a-year newsroom? And they realized that they had a content shop. They had not yet really developed all of the things they would need to develop on the business side of things to support that content shop. You know, Nicole Holloway, their business manager, Nicole's brilliant. I think she's one of the sharpest minds in public media today. But it was, for a long time, her against the world trying to support, you know, a newsroom of 15 to 18 people. Meanwhile, St. Louis Public Radio really sort of understood that they're a membership organization. They know how to raise money, you know, from individual donations of $25 all the way up to grant projects of $1 million. But they realized they didn't really have the news infrastructure to fill the gaps left by the decline of the Post-Dispatch in a meaningful way. They had, as many public radio stations had, a half dozen people doing cut-ins on Morning Edition and All Things Considered. That is an almost perfect marriage of interests. We're a content shop that needs a membership organization. We're a membership organization that needs more content. You know, that's why they fit together so nicely.
Sure.
I think the fascinating thing over the next few years, market by market and on the national level, is looking for more opportunities like that.
Well, it dovetails with my next question, really, and we'll take in this idea that you've also been an adjunct instructor for American University on the subject of media entrepreneurship. And I guess I'm wondering, in the course of your career where you've spanned print, online, now broadcast, and then where you've had the chance to be an instructor on a college level in the idea of media entrepreneurship, what are the business models out there that you think are promising?
You know, the number one is a variation on the traditional public media model, which is part of the reason why I'm in public media and planning on staying there for as long as they'll have me. I will say the models available for sustainable journalism organizations beyond that have real problems. It's a pretty bleak landscape beyond that. When you think about it, and this is one of the fundamental things that I come back on when I teach a class similar to this, the traditional advertising model for media organizations was based on scarcity. I am the Post-Dispatch. I run a great journalism organization, a multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism organization. But that's not why people support us. That's not how we make money. Bundled into that Post-Dispatch public service newsroom was a monopoly on help wanted ads, a near monopoly on used car ads, and an effective monopoly on help wanted ads.
And a printing press.
And a printing press, and a distribution system. And together, that bundle was essentially unassailable for more than a half century. Well, the technology we are using to talk with each other asynchronously, when you count the students who are watching this later, destroys every one of those bundle elements and strips bare the financial underpinnings of great journalism, whether that was on television, whether it was on radio, whether it was on print. Advertising-based models are destroyed by the fact that there's a glut of advertising inventory out there, and there's no longer a need to bundle your ads tightly to the journalism that happened to come along in that package. So I am highly skeptical that advertising will ever be the basic and primary means of support for journalism in the future. Doesn't mean advertising is not one of the many legs of the stool, but we're going from a world where there were 3 or 4 big stools in print: help wanted, used cars, real estate ads to a lesser degree, to a world where our stools may have 15 or 20 different legs, each of which is skinnier, but together they support the organization. So I think we're in a place now where the sort of work that public media has traditionally done, appealing to people's nobler intents, solving problems for people like I want to feel better about myself and the role that I play in making this community a better place, that becomes our fundamental means of support.
Well, I want you to talk more about what you mean by those skinnier legs. Mm-hmm. For example, what are some of those legs?
So I tear apart students in my class who say a lot of them are working journalists at DC places. Great. What's the primary means of support for the company you work for? Advertising. It's like, really? That's it? Well, yeah. But you start peeling the onion and you realize advertising covers a great variety of sins. I tend to try to force people to think about lines of business. A line of business meaning it literally has its own line on the spreadsheet for tracking and management. It probably has its own fundraising or sales manager. It certainly has its own sales force to a discrete group of customers, because the needs of car dealers in the old print paradigm are radically different than the needs of the help wanted advertisers. So you manage those businesses, those lines of business separately. Translate that into the public media world. One of the things that I learned when I got over here a few years ago and started tearing apart the numbers is even, remind me, what are the call letters of St. Louis Public Radio? I should know that, but I don't.
KWMU.
Okay, so KWMU, they make a lot of money off you donating $25 out of guilt during pledge season. But they also make a substantial amount of money off major donors. Rich people who may have started as that $25 donor years ago, but the station engaged them and built up a relationship with them, and they figured out, oh, that one over there is really interested in science content. Let's pitch him to be the major donor to support our Science Now initiative. And we're going to get $15,000 or $20,000 a year out of them. So you've got individuals, you've got those major donors. In many cases, there are foundations that are their own line of business and their own management. And then you've got, blatant advertising sales called corporate underwriting in the world of public media. So at a typical public media station that's producing any significant amounts of local content, there are really at least 4 different skinny legs supporting that stool, supporting that business.
Okay. And I'll clarify, too, KWMU is the public radio station, KETC is the TV station, and to be honest with you, I have no idea how they're related, or if they are at all.
They're friendly with each other, but they are separately licensed and they are separately incorporated 501c3s. A small digression. In a world where digital, where all media are digital media, the traditional distinctions between a public television station and a public radio station start to blur. 5 years ago, when I had not actually started my job at PBS, but I had accepted it, I happened to be in a city where I spend some of my vacation time. I figured as long as I'm here, I might as well start sucking up now to the general manager. He's nice enough. He happens to serve on the PBS board of directors. He's a nice guy. He takes me out to lunch along with his deputy. And I start saying, so what's the future look like 10 years out if NPR is simply delivered as a digital stream and PBS is available on demand as a digital stream? What's the difference between you and the separate radio organization up the street? Why shouldn't these organizations all just merge? Not knowing the background that those two organizations at that time happened to be in the middle of a major feud, the stone face comes down. And the deputy looks over at me and says, would you like a side of heresy with your dessert? But from the audience perspective, that's a legitimate question. If all media are digital media, what are these organizations? I would say there in St. Louis, Jack Galmish, the president and CEO of 9 Network, gets along famously with the folks from the radio side. He helped put together the Beacon merger because the Beacon had been housed in his building, and he recognized that radio is just a better home for it because he's not a news shop. Does that mean at some point those organizations could, who knows? They get along there, unlike, there are markets where the PBS and the NPR station are one. They are one organization, Oregon Public Broadcasting being an excellent example of that. There are other markets where they don't speak to each other. They loathe each other. Sooner or later, the economics will force some rationalization there.
Let me let Tina get a question in here. Go ahead.
Please.
And introduce yourself if you could, Tina.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Tina Krupin. I'm going on my 6th year of getting my undergrad. So
Outstanding.
Yeah, and I'm old, so I'm hanging in there. Anyway, before I wanted to back up, you said one of your legs. Does PBS, they get a lot of government funding, don't they?
PBS itself gets very little government funding. Now, an individual station gets a fair amount of government funding.
Is there a big umbrella? Like, is PBS an umbrella, and then everyone has a franchise, sort of?
Almost the other way around. PBS is an umbrella, but it's a member association. It is not a television network, and it is certainly not the parent organization. St. Louis Public Media, or St. Louis Public Television, the 9 Network, is an independently chartered 501c3, locally headquartered organization. They own the license. They choose to join PBS, which means they get Downton Abbey and a lot of other shows as a result. They pay money for the privilege of getting that. They get a vote. And they get to vote on things like who's the president going to be at PBS? Who's going to be the dozen or so PBS station general managers who serve, along with some outside directors, on the PBS board of directors? Who gets to hire and fire that president? Jack Galmish, in fact, from 9 Network, is on that board of directors today. So PBS is much more a tail that is wagged by the dogs of these 160 member stations than it is a television network. NPR is a little different. It's much more of a traditional network. But the federal money is absolutely an important leg of the stool. The federal government doles out it's just shy of $400 million a year to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, under arcane formulas, some of which date back to the 1967 Public Broadcasting Act, which is crazy. It's 50 years, people. Come on. Let's change the formula. 3/4 of that money has to go to television stations, leaving 1/4 for radio and for other projects, because television is more expensive. Well, in a digital media age, does that make sense? No, but you try changing a law in Congress right now. So 9 Network gets a base grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to stay on the air. In the case of 9 Network, it's probably a couple $1,000,000 a year. There are stations that get close to 8-figure money. Most get 7-figure money. A few get only 6-figure money if they're really, really tiny. That money certainly provides a base of support for the station, but all it's going to do, if that's all you had, you could keep the lights on, you could keep the signal tower running, and that's it. So for a typical station, there's the federal money. Depending on the state, they may or may not get some state money. About half of the states still offer money to their public television and public radio stations in the state. If they're licensed to a university, the way mine is here at UNCTV, it's a service of the University of North Carolina system. Thank you. The university will throw in some money. But in most cases, if you add up all of the government, state, local, and all of the institutional money, that's only about half the budget of the organization. The other half is coming from viewers and listeners, and the foundations and the major donors. You show me a station where they're getting more than half of their support from government and their institutional licensee, I will show you a station that is poised to have a really ugly day in the future when one or more of those partners chainsaws them. In fact, the station to my south at South Carolina was like that. Their state funding of $5 or $6 million a year went to zero during the recession, and they laid off half their staff. So certainly I neglected the government support. It's an important one of those legs, yes.
I went to an event at our KETC a couple weeks ago. I am a member of our Channel 9, and the audience was over 70 years old.
Yep.
Probably a lot of those audience members has Channel 9 in their foundations or their wills, but what are you going to do in 20 years to get the younger people to start donating?
So when I want to scare the hell out of people, and as a digital guy, I specialize in that, I remind people of the kind of experiences that Kurt and I got to go through over the last 10 years, which is where our old industry, the newspaper industry, looked right at all of these challenges. We depend financially on monopolies over help wanted and car and real estate and other forms of ads. Gee, this internet thing could really destroy that monopoly. We'll worry about that someday. And it went from record profits in that industry in 2004 to the beginning of revenue free fall in 2005. In the ensuing 10 years, the revenue for that industry has been cut in half. Adjusted for inflation, we are somewhere back in the post-World War II period in terms of where the money is, which is why newsrooms are half of what they were 10 years ago. When I want to scare people in public media, I remind them what happened to my old industry will happen to us. The difference is we have a slightly longer runway, but there's incredible urgency now to fix those problems. And Tina, you nailed it. On the radio side, the median age of a donor to an NPR station is typically in the mid-40s.
Mm-hmm.
On the television side, the median age of a donor to their PBS station, the last time I looked, was 67. That's a problem. An even bigger problem. 20 years ago, that median age was 52.
Really?
We have, on the television side, accomplished what I think is a rather astounding and neat trick. Our audience has aged almost 1 year for every year that goes by on the calendar. We're not replacing them with younger viewers. And that leads to a really ugly demographic cliff about 10 years from now. Now, there are people who go whistling by the graveyard in public media who will say with their darkest gallows humor, wow, that's a great opportunity for estate planning, isn't it?
Sure.
Get that money once and only once. I would say the challenge we have is how do we remind people of the fundamental value of public television? How do we get people who are older than age 8, which is where the PBS Kids program loses their audience constantly, older than 8 but younger than 50, really younger than 60. There are interesting experiments going on. PBS and many of our member stations do really fascinating digital shorts distributed primarily through YouTube. Some of which are fabulous and some of which are starting to show promise as vehicles for guilting people into making a donation. It helps that shows like Downton Abbey, Indian Summers, which is fabulous, a show that'll premiere in January called Mercy Street, which is, think of Downton Abbey in the Civil War with lots of blood and gore and a little bit of sex, but also the historic accuracy that PBS is known for. Those dramas in particular are actually showing some promise in reaching audiences that aren't in their 50s and 60s, but we have a ton of work to do to figure out how to replace the money that we're getting from that 67-year-old grandma today so that 10 years from now, where she's either passed on or is in a nursing home and ain't writing us checks anymore, we have other people who are willing to write checks. As I say all the time at the end of that scary talk where I try and break people out of their complacency, it's like I've flown an airplane into the side of the mountain once. My last job at Tribune Interactive was drawing up a layoff list of about 300 people in various newsrooms that I was responsible for across Tribune. And at the end of that rather soul-sucking exercise, I told my boss, put my name at the bottom of that layoff list as well. I've flown the airplane into the side of the mountain once. I am not signing up for the sequel. We're going to fix public television or die trying. But you nailed it. It's the audience problem.
So I'm not sure if Jacob is on in order to and able to ask a question. So I'll pause for a second, and
I see the mute symbol over his avatar.
Right. But he sent me a question that sort of you started to answer in responding to Tina's. So I'm going to go ahead and ask that one.
Okay.
Do you think, and again, you started to answer this, do you think PBS, both on air and online, is sometimes overlooked as a news source by the public because it isn't as, quote, flashy or dramatic as cable news? Is this something that's considered internally? And if so, can you address whether there's anything to be done about it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and one that a lot of people grapple with. PBS produces relatively little news when you think about it. We probably produce, well, news hour, 6 hours a week, so that's 300 hours a year, give or take. Frontline will do 30 new hours a year, give or take. You know, we're looking at well under 400 hours per year. Hell, there are local television shops that do 400 hours of live local news a month. On the other hand, Frontline is, bar none, the finest investigative journalism broadcast on television in the United States, bar none. And NewsHour, in its own niche audience, too much talking heads way, is a reasoned and reasonable place to turn in a world of talking heads screaming at each other on cable. I don't think the capacity is there to do more than what we do now. We can promote it better. I think, Jacob, a more interesting possibility is, how does PBS take what we do and amplify its impact by partnering more thoughtfully with NPR? We're really, for the first time ever, doing a lot of election planning for 2016 jointly with NPR. How do we thoughtfully engage both PBS and NPR stations on a local level that are producing stuff and surface that and highlight it for more national distribution? How could PBS and NPR, for that matter, or local stations like mine, partner more thoughtfully with nonprofits like the Beacon in St. Louis or like ProPublica on a national level? I really think, because money is so tight everywhere, saying PBS needs to do a big new initiative that's going to cost several $1,000,000 a year. That was what I was hired to do at PBS. It didn't last long, in part because we couldn't afford it. A better question and a better model to play with and explore is, what collaborations, what partnerships, short-term and long-term, are out there that allow us to expose great work that others are already doing and get a bigger audience for our own great work? I hope that answered his question.
Yeah, good. So switching gears a little bit here, another student, Bradley Gross, I think you had said something about Facebook being the app you can't live without at some point, and he wanted to
probably. Sounds like something I might say. If I didn't, I'll happily claim it.
Why is that, and do you think that that is something that can be sustained? He wants to know if we may anticipate the day when Facebook craters as well.
You know, I think it's certainly a possibility that Facebook craters. Even more likely is that Facebook's mind share, if you will, gets pecked to death not by some big new behemoth, but by 1,000 ducks. You know, I already see this with my kids who are all in their teens and early 20s. You know, I have to cajole them to respond to a Facebook message, and it's because they're on Instagram and Snapchat and God knows what else, in part because they know I'm not there. But eventually I find them. I would say a lesson that we can draw against that, I think Facebook is the app you can live without, to borrow somebody's phrase, because it allows personal connections in a meaningful way. And smart news organizations figure out how to use that both for promotion. You know, here's a great story we did that people in your social network like, but also to tap the two-way interactive aspect of that, to use it to improve our own reporting. Kurt will laugh at this. I still remember interactive voice response in the 1990s, where we discovered, under the leadership of a project director named Kurt Greenbaum, that, you know, if we ask thoughtful questions and ask people from the public to dial, in essence, a voicemail box and give us story tips or give us, you know, a tiny shred of their story, some of those people then become the lead anecdote in the Sunday package that we're trying to write. And it's a hell of a lot easier to find them that way rather than just roaming the street at random, or worse, asking one of the interested, quote, experts on the story, do you have any real human being I can talk to? Facebook is that amplified by 1,000. Clearly, we need to apply journalistic thinking to that. You know, I see mistakes all over the place where people get scammed and duped on Facebook, not realizing that they're getting astroturfed and that, in fact, that's an interested party feeding you that anecdote. So journalistic skepticism is absolutely vital there. But I think as reporters, we should recognize there's this two-way conversation, two-way, hell, multi-way conversation going on all around us that is incredibly valuable and more genuine than most of the stuff that we've done historically in reporting. If we're smart enough to figure out how to tap into that, we're going to do a much better job of serving our audiences and getting those audiences to recognize our value.
So it's not too far of a leap to ask this question from talking about Facebook. What are your habits? I mean, where are you going to find what's going on in the world? What are the apps that you have on here? How do you use this box?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. In my web browser, and it's been this way for years, I have 4 windows designed to spawn and log on the moment I open the browser. The junk email account that all my commercial marketers have. The real email account that all my friends have. The inevitable work email account. And Facebook, believe it or not. Because Facebook really is a news feed to me. Because I tend to read a lot of Washington Post content, the Facebook algorithm constantly feeds the Washington Post stuff to me. Same to a lesser degree with New York Times. Same to a much lesser degree with content that gets recommended by friends. It does become a very nicely filtered feed for me, and it's asynchronous. I use Twitter a fair amount. I don't tweet myself that much anymore, and my digital director is yelling me about that now that I'm on day 6. He wants to amplify and reach my network. Facebook I find to be invaluable for a real-time fire hose that's sort of a quasi-curated feed. You know, Facebook can be hours behind. You know, Dave Beard at the Washington Post, another mutual friend of ours, would hit send on an item when he was social media editor at the Post. It might be 6 hours before the Facebook algorithm deigns to show that to me. Twitter, when something really bad's going on, you know, major news event, or my wife is a New York Mets fan, so yeah, you know, some thug does a barrel roll takeout slide and breaks my wife's favorite starting shortstop leg. Twitter's much better for that real-time now stuff. That's where the news finds me, to steal the line that I think Jarvis helped popularize. Beyond that, I've got a bunch of niche apps that I use. I am looking for a house right now. So on the phone, which is on its charger over there, I got Zillow and Realtor.com. Probably won't be there in 6 weeks. You know, I use Instagram mostly to keep an eye on my daughter. Depending on the ebb and flow. If it's baseball season, yeah, MLB at bat is on there. Since my team washed out, yeah, not so much between now and the end of February. So I would say for me as a user, my core apps are email, Facebook, and whatever social media account of the moment I need to keep an eye on my kids. And then many other apps swim in or out as needed. I think what's important is recognizing there's no such thing as the audience singular anymore. Everyone's app and social media habits are likely to be different, and as we think about how do we get our work, our journalism distributed, we have to think with that audience's plural mindset and figure out how we use all of these things not just to promote but also to engage.
I want to go back to a question that I asked a little bit earlier, but see if I can get you to tease it apart a little bit more. Mm-hmm. I know that you have done similar things to what we're doing here. You've had guests in your classes talking about some of the novel or unique or interesting business models they've come up with.
Yeah.
What are some of those examples? Why did you pick those particular examples to dive into a little bit?
So a couple I'll throw out there. Laura and Chris Amico are the founders of Homicide Watch DC, a much lauded project that noted that, just as in South Florida when Kurt and I worked there, there are a lot of murders in the city of Washington that get 3 paragraphs on an inside page of the Washington Post, and that's it. And they set up Homicide Watch to really tell every story, chronicle every murder, remember every life, which is not quite but as close to Laura's tagline. They went off an interesting business model of, we know there will be a dedicated audience here and we'll figure out what to do with it, with the help of a lot of grant money at the beginning. I think they figured out at the end there, in fact, was no business model for it. And that, in fact, for a project like that to live, it has to be attached to another media organization that has a sustainable model. So that's one where they solved a problem for the audience. They solved the content problem. They did not necessarily solve the sustainability problem. So that's one that's not a terribly encouraging tale. A different one, arts coverage has cratered all over journalism. If you're an old Hack City editor and you have to lay off a big chunk of your staff, who are you going to shoot first? Your City Hall reporter, your investigative reporter, or your arts reviewer? I know who I'm shooting first. So another old friend of ours, Bill Hirschman, in a fit of pique, launched a theater review site. Bill is a theater junkie. He, in fact, went to Missouri. And he has turned that into a paying venture. It's him and a couple of freelancers, and it's probably low 5-figure money a year. It is not enough to support Bill on his own. He uses that as a supplement to all of his other freelance income, and he's in his 60s. He's semi-retired now. But it's an interesting model to me because it's a niche site dealing with a very impassioned and passionate but small audience. There are advertisers who will still pay to reach, and pay dearly to reach, that narrow audience. And in Bill's case, he is filling some of that gap left by the collapse of traditional organizations, and doing it in a way that you can look at it and say, that thing will still be there 5 years from now if Bill still cares. So the advertising model is still a good one. For niche sites that appeal to passionate audiences, communities of interest, not necessarily communities of geography. More broadly than that...
What's his site called, by the way?
South Florida Theater Review.com. It actually grew out of a failed similar effort from the old classical musical writer in Florida, but that's a whole case study that I ended up writing up. I would say, without taking a lot of our time here, there's been work that's been published by the Newspaper Association of America under their Newspaper Next project. Ironically, the Newspaper Association of America, and that project don't really exist anymore. The American Press Institute doesn't exist at all. It was subsumed by NAA. But the whole notion that Clark Gilbert spun out of pioneering business work that Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School did, I think applies. Identify a problem that somebody has that you can solve, and you can solve better than anybody else in the world. And you've got a much better chance of identifying somebody willing to write a check to you to sustain your business if you're actually solving a real problem. I think one of the knocks that I would make on our old profession, and journalism in particular, newspapers were solving so many problems that they weren't really solving any of them particularly well. The only ones they were solving particularly well were those classified advertising monopolies, and they were so lucrative that we were unwilling and unable to solve them using new, cheaper methods, because that might cost us money, and don't take that money away. Mm-hmm. So we just left the door open for the monster.coms and the auto traders to solve those problems better and take the money from us.
So now I'm looking at another question from one of our students, Mary Rousseau, which almost perfectly dovetails with what you just said. Why do you think large media organizations still don't seem to recognize that their business model has imploded and will not go back to the way it was before? Then,
go ahead.
well, I was going to say, then she goes on and says, there's technology here, obviously, that plays a role in that, but technology also changes so rapidly. Innovation may not be enough to save media.
I think that's exactly right, and I would say that a big shift I've noticed in the last 5 or 6 years is they actually do recognize that their model is doomed, and that the good old days are not coming back. Really, it did take until about 2009, 2010 for that realization to sink in. A lot of us who started in digital, particularly in the late 90s, spent the period from the late 90s through about 2006 screaming at the top of our lungs, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And yet, the answer we got back in 2004 was, record profits. You're wrong.
And the other answer we got was giving up dollars to chase pennies.
Right. And we'll deal with that problem when it becomes a problem. Look, the why that happens, that's Clay Christensen's entire career. The Innovator's Dilemma, I would encourage everybody to read it. I would say since then, though, there's been this trap that Christensen also talks about in The Innovator's Dilemma. The scope of the losses of revenue were so rapid and so huge that almost all the management attention over the last 10 years has been dealing with the decline. How do we simply keep the lights on and make payroll? How do we, and in that environment, it is almost impossible to find the money and the mental bandwidth, the management bandwidth, to try innovative projects. Clark Gilbert, who grew up as a disciple of Clay Christensen, says, the paradox of disruptive change is when you have the money and the time, you don't have the will. Once you get the will, you no longer have the money nor the time. Which is why I think it's important, and the only hope that I have for the world I'm in now of public media is they've seen enough bodies lying by the side of the road. The entire newspaper industry, big chunks of broadcast television, especially in non-battleground states, because local broadcast television is being propped up by political money right now. Gee, does Facebook and the interwebs do political ads pretty well? Yeah, I give it 2 more election cycles. Radio is in the midst of getting completely eviscerated. The only way radio has been able to sort of paper over their financial woes is everybody buying everybody else and getting scale economies. In public media, I think enough people have started to see the bodies littering the media landscape and realizing, no, we have to change. That keeps me going and allows me to sleep at night and come into work every day with a smile on my face thinking there's still a chance.
Tina, I want to give you a chance again if there's another question that's come up that you'd like to ask. If not, that's okay too.
Oh, I was just going to comment about the Facebook, because I think Facebook is another thing that young kids do not do. I have a teenager.
That's right.
He does not Facebook. I check it like too many times every day. But again, the younger people are doing Instagram or something else. So, it's just another, I don't know, I don't know what's going to replace Facebook. Like in our genre, we don't want, it's so easy to use, I don't want it to change. When it changes every 3 months, I get so mad, like, oh, what?
Yeah.
So,
I think the common element there, whether it's Snapchat, Instagram, the innumerable nets that want to come up behind it, or services like Periscope in the Twitterverse. It's easy, it's relatively easy to use technology to solve a content problem. Gee, I don't want that embarrassing Facebook video of me, I'm talking as my 21-year-old son now, me holding a red Solo cup, I don't want that sucker to live on Facebook forever. You know, hence the appeal of Snapchat. It disappears. Actually, it doesn't. That's his problem. It's easy to solve the content problem. Solving the sustainability problem. How does Snapchat support itself? That's trickier. That's a lot trickier. Simply saying we'll get ads and we'll sell ads around it is not a sophisticated enough answer. I think the more interesting thing, Google is brilliant at this, Facebook has gotten brilliant at this. How does one mine the behavioral data that you're able to develop off of those content apps and use that to generate revenue? I will say, hearkening way back to the beginning, that project I worked on at PBS called Member Video on Demand, the Amazon Prime-like service, because you're a donor to 9 Network, to KETC. Here's a bucket of content that you get that's not available to anybody else. That's solving the content problem in a way. But the real camel's nose of that project is, number one, we're rewarding you for donating money to Channel 9. So maybe you're going to be slightly more likely to donate money again next year. But the camel's nose is we're watching that data. And that data hopefully will allow us to figure out how to make better pitches in the future. Here's the reality about public media. No more than 10% of the people who watch a PBS station or listen to an NPR station will write that station a check at any point in time. And the number of people who do so consistently, year after year after year, 5% at most. That's pretty bleak. Particularly for PBS, we issue these very broad-based appeals. I see direct mail all the time from PBS stations that says, viewers like you help to bring Sesame Street and Nova and Downton Abbey to viewers here in metropolitan Whoville. Thank you. Well, that appeal is kind of meaningless when you think about it, because nobody in Whoville is a rabid consumer of Sesame Street and Nova and Downton Abbey. And yet, just like my Amazon homepage is going to be radically different than Kurt's Amazon homepage, the data mining techniques out there exist to allow us, if we're smart, to understand, no, Tina, you like the cooking shows, and I'm making all this up. You like the cooking and the science shows, and really, Sesame Street, not so much, and the costume dramas, not at all. Well, that allows us conceivably to create these pitches that say, viewers like you help found Nova and Nature. And oh, by the way, did you see The Secret Life of the Meerkat last week? Wasn't it awesome? And that's a great pitch. It appeals to the emotions and might get you to write a check. Actually, we know we lost meerkats.
All right, 3 more quick questions for you, and we're coming up on the top of the hour.
Yeah, and
yep. So Neela would like to know, what do you think aspiring journalists really need to know to be relevant today?
Semper Gumby, always flexible. First, know how to report and tell a great story. But then second, understand how the technology of the moment, which will always change, Moore's Law is not being repealed anytime soon, how the technology of the moment allows you to distribute your great reporting, tell that story in an interesting way, but also interact and use the tools for the reporting. I think if you can do those things, you will stay flexible and stay relevant over time. As an addendum, I'll say there is always the need for some subset of our newsrooms to worry about the business side and the sustainability side. Certainly that's a role that I've taken on, Kurt has at different points. Not all of us can worry about what's happening on the other side of that wall. Some of us have to, and some of us have to be on the other side of that wall, because left to their own devices, they're not going to think about these sustainability issues in ways that serves the cause of journalism well over the long term.
All right. The students all have a final project in this class to develop some sort of journalistic enterprise and a business plan for that. I wonder if you have any thoughts, advice, ideas.
This is a straight steal. I use it in my syllabus, and more, the whole lean startup movement really exemplifies this notion. The best way to know if your project is any good or not is to get out and talk to people who are intended to be both the audience and the paying customers for that project. To quote Steve Blank, who's an entrepreneur in residence at Stanford and at Cal Berkeley, that's a neat trick, teaches entrepreneurship and is one of the mentors of Jeff Rice, the founder of Lean Startup Movement. Steve Blank always says, no business plan survives first contact with a customer. So in order to know if your business plan, if your project is any good or not, go talk to the people. Go talk to the audience, go talk to the paying customers. When Steve Blank teaches a class, he makes people talk to 50 potential customers. What I tell my students is, I'm not going to hit you with that, but you'd better talk to a half dozen.
Good idea. Yeah. All right, last one. So you're not in Washington, you're not at PBS headquarters anymore. Which Muppet are you going to miss in the break room?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. My old boss, Paula Kerger, the president of PBS, gives this impassioned speech. She's always asked, who's your favorite Muppet? Paula is tall, ash blonde, Big Bird. And it's not just because I'm tall and blonde, but because he has this childlike sense of wonder, blah, blah, blah. It's a wonderful spiel, and I'm sure it's heartfelt from Paula. For me, there is no question at all. My favorite Muppet of all time, the one I miss from the break room, but the one who's about 50 feet down that hallway right now is Cookie Monster.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate your time. And when we're all done here, I will send you a link to this. It'll be on YouTube as soon as YouTube is done gobbling it up.
Okay. Well, I hope it's useful to folks. If folks have any follow-up questions, tdavidson@unctv.org.
Thanks very much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, all, and good luck with the Cardinals tonight.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks.